My darling Leo, I see you. I see what you have been carrying, and I am going to begin tonight by making a distinction that almost nobody makes, and that I think will save some of you a considerable amount of time. Somebody from your past is going to return with regret. I believe that. I would not have built an hour around it otherwise, and I will explain to you why it happens to your sign more than to any other, and it is structural rather than flattering. But regret is not one thing, my darling. It is 5 things, and they feel identical when they arrive, and they mean entirely different things about what is actually being offered. And there is a second distinction, and it is the one I want you to carry through this whole reading. Regret is not the same as wanting you back. Those two arrive in the same envelope, and your sign opens the envelope and reads them as one message, and they are not. A person can be genuinely, deeply, sincerely sorry about how they treated you, and have no wish whatsoever to resume anything. Both of those can be entirely true in the same human being at the same moment, and there is no contradiction in it at all. I am not telling you that to be cold with you. I am telling you because the single most painful thing I watch Leos go through is not being left. It is receiving an apology, believing it to be an opening, and discovering some weeks later that it was a closing, and having to grieve the same thing twice. Stay with me, because I am going to do 4 things tonight. First, I will explain why your sign specifically is the one people come back to apologize to. This is structural and it is genuinely unusual, and I do not think anybody has explained it to you properly. Then I will give you the 5 kinds of regret. 5. And they are specific. And once you can tell them apart, you will know within one conversation which one you have received, which is information that most people spend 2 years working out the expensive way. Then the cards. And 2 stories, one where it resolved well, and one where it did not. And at the very end, I will tell you the single most useful thing I know about receiving an apology. I want to warn you now that it is going to sound, for about 30 seconds, like the most cynical thing I have ever said in one of these readings. It is not cynical. It is the most freeing piece of information I have to offer you, and it takes about a minute to become that, and I need you to be there for the whole minute. I have watched Leos misunderstand this one point for 35 years, and it is the reason so many of you are still, years later, waiting for an apology to do something that an apology is structurally incapable of doing. I am Madame Aurora, 35 years studying the stars from my office in Manhattan, and let me be honest with you before we go further, because honesty is what your sign actually respects, and warmth without accuracy makes you suspicious, correctly. This reading is not tied to any week or month or year. I built it that way deliberately. A great many readings on this subject are constructed around a passing alignment, and a person finds one 2 years later and is told the sky has arranged a return for her when the alignment dissolved long ago. Everything I say tonight rests on the permanent structure of your sign and on how regret actually behaves in human beings, and it will be as accurate whenever you find this as it is tonight. And I am not going to describe a person and let you fill in a name. That is the standard construction of readings like this, and I have never had much respect for it. You will fill in a name anyway, everybody does, and I am not going to build the hour around encouraging it. Now let me tell you why it is your sign. There are 2 reasons, and they are both structural. The first is that your sign is ruled by the sun, and the sun is the only body in the entire chart that does not orbit anything. Every other planet is defined by its relationship to something else, measured against something, positioned relative to a center. The sun is the center. It is the thing they are all measured against. And what that produces in a person is not superiority. It produces a reference point. My darling, people who have been close to you do not simply remember you. They remember what things looked like in your light, which is a completely different kind of memory, and which does not decay at the same rate. And crucially, for tonight's subject, it means that when they later behave badly toward somebody else, or watch somebody behave badly toward them, they have a standard available to measure it against, and the standard is you. That is the mechanism of Leo regret, and I want you to understand it properly, because it explains the timing. People do not usually come back to a Leo because they have been thinking fondly of the past. They come back because something in their present has been measured against you and found wanting, and the measurement was involuntary. The second reason is about how you end things, and it is less comfortable. Your sign is fixed fire, and fixed is the modality of holding. And what that produces, at the end of a relationship, is a Leo who does not fight for very long once she has decided. You will hold a position for years, tolerating a great deal, being generous past the point of reason, and then something breaks and you go with more dignity than the situation deserves. You do not scream. Most of you do not beg. You do not send the 11 messages. What you do is withdraw the warmth, cleanly, and leave. And my darling, that is the single most memorable exit in the zodiac. Because the person on the other side of it does not experience it as a row. They experience it as a light going out, and there is nothing to argue with, and nothing to win, and no version of events in which they were provoked. Your dignity gives them nothing to hold on to except the fact of their own behavior, and a person left holding only that will eventually, when their defenses are down, look at it. That is why they come back. Not because you were the most beautiful or the most exciting, because you left them with an unusually clean view of themselves, and there is no chapter in a person's life more likely to be revisited than the one in which they cannot blame anybody else. There are also 2 rhythms worth knowing, because your sign runs on cycles, and this is not random. The first is your solar return. Your ruler returns to its exact original position in your chart once a year, on or about your birthday, and for your sign, that period is the most charged of the year, every year, for life. Things that have been sitting quietly come up for air, and it works in both directions, my darling. A good number of Leos receive contact from the past in the weeks around their own birthday, and it is not mystical, it is simply that a birthday is one of the few dates about another person that people reliably retain. The second is the 12-year rhythm of Jupiter returning to your sign, which is the most expansive year of every 12, and in a great many Leo lives coincides with people from earlier chapters reappearing. Sometimes in person, sometimes as dreams, sometimes through a mutual acquaintance, sometimes as a period in which the past becomes unusually vivid for no reason you can identify. Now let me give you the 5 kinds. This is the part I most want you to have. Regret is not one substance. It comes in 5 forms, and they arrive in almost identical language, and only 2 of them can become anything. The first kind is regret for the loss. This is the most common, and it is the one people mean when they say somebody regrets losing you. Something has gone from their life and they feel the absence. They miss the warmth, the ease, the specific quality of being around you. And I want to be careful, because this one is genuine, and it is also the least informative of the 5. Missing something is a report on the present. It says the current arrangement is worse than the previous one. It says nothing whatsoever about whether the person has understood why the previous one ended, and a considerable number of returns of this kind involve somebody who wants the warmth back and has done no work at all on the thing that removed it. The tell for this kind is that the language is about them. I miss you. I have not been the same. Nothing has been right since. Notice that in every one of those sentences, the subject is the speaker, and the object is a feeling of their own. The second kind is regret for the conduct. This is the moral one, and it is considerably rarer. Here the person is not primarily reporting an absence, they are reporting a judgment they have made about their own behavior. The tell is specificity. A person in this kind of regret can name the thing, not the relationship, not the ending in general, the particular occasion, the particular thing said, the particular time they let you carry something alone. And they name it without being prompted, and usually without softening it, and quite often, they name something you had almost forgotten and are startled to hear raised. My darling, if you receive this kind, you have received something rare, and I want you to know that regardless of what happens next, because a great many people never receive it at all. The third kind is regret for the timing. This is the one that says it could have worked in different circumstances. We met at the wrong point, I was not in a position, if it had been 5 years later. And I want to be honest with you about this one, because it is the most seductive of the 5 and the least substantial. Sometimes it is entirely true, timing is real. People do meet each other during periods in which they are genuinely incapable of what the situation required. But it is also the most available explanation in the world, and it has a specific quality, which is that it exonerates everybody. Nobody behaved badly. Nothing needs examining. The circumstances did it. A person can hold regret of this kind for decades without ever once looking at their own part, and it will feel to them like grief and to you like an opening, and it very often produces nothing at all. The fourth kind is regret for the person they were. This one is the deepest and it is the least about you. Here the person has changed, substantially, usually through something difficult, and looking back at who they were during your chapter produces something close to shame. They are not primarily sorry about you. They are sorry about themselves, and you happen to be the clearest available evidence of who they were. My darling, this one frequently produces the most moving message you will ever receive, and it is also the one least likely to become a resumption, because a person in this state is not reaching toward you. They are reaching back toward a version of themselves they are trying to complete. And the fifth kind, which I include because it is real, and because leaving it out would be dishonest, is regret as a symptom. Something in their present life is going badly. A relationship has ended. A period has turned out disappointingly, and the past becomes vivid, as the past always does when the present is thin, and you are in it, and the warmth of that memory is genuinely felt, and is being generated almost entirely by current conditions. The tell for this one is timing, and it is not subtle. Notice what has recently changed in their life. If the return coincides with a loss, an ending, a significant birthday, or a period of visible difficulty, then some proportion of what you are receiving is about the difficulty, and it will recede when the difficulty does. And a great many Leos have found this out at considerable expense. Now let me tell you what each of the five can actually become, because knowing which kind you have received is only useful if you know what it is capable of. Regret for the loss can become a resumption, and it is the kind most likely to, and it is also the kind most likely to reproduce the original ending, because nothing has been examined. The warmth is being sought, and the cause of its removal has not been addressed, and warmth restored without that produces, in my experience, about 14 months and then the same conversation. If this is your kind and you want to proceed, the entire question is whether they can name what happened. Ask directly. Their answer within about 30 seconds tells you everything. Regret for the conduct can become almost anything, and it is the only one of the five that can produce a genuinely different relationship rather than a repetition. Not because the person is better, but because somebody who can name their own part has done the work that makes a second version possible. My darling, if this is what you have received, you are entitled to take your time with it, and you are also entitled to decline it, and I want to say that clearly, because the quality of an apology creates no obligation whatsoever in the person receiving it. Regret for the timing can become a friendship, and very rarely becomes anything else. It is the kind that produces long, warm, entirely unresolved correspondences that run for years. If this is your kind and you want more than that, you will have to ask a direct question about the present rather than the past, and the answer will usually arrive as a change of subject. Regret for the person they were is the most moving and the least available. It very rarely becomes a resumption, and I would ask you not to read that as a rejection, because it is not one. Somebody reaching back to complete a version of themselves is not reaching toward you, and the most generous thing you can do with this kind, if you have any generosity available, is to let them have the completion without requiring it to mean something about your future. And regret as a symptom becomes nothing, my darling. I am sorry to be plain about it. It is genuine while the conditions producing it persist and it recedes with them, and the tell is that it arrives with unusual intensity and unusual speed, and Leos are particularly susceptible to it because intensity reads to your sign as sincerity, and the two are not related. Now, my darling, before I go on, I want you to do something with me, and it will take 20 seconds. Think of whoever arrived when I said the word regret at the beginning. Do not second-guess it. Your sign will produce a more sensible candidate within about 4 seconds, and the second one is nearly always worse. Now go through the 5. Loss, conduct, timing, the person they were, or symptom. Which one do you believe it is? Not which one you would like. Which one you actually believe, in the part of you that has already worked it out and has been declining to say so. Hold your answer. I am going to ask you for it later, and I would rather you chose before you know why. Now let me show you what the cards are saying, my darling. I pulled 3 tonight, and before I describe them, I want to note something about the spread itself, because it is unusual and it is the most useful thing in this entire section. All 3 came up in swords. There is not a single cup here, not one. And for a reading about somebody returning with regret, that is a genuinely striking absence. and it is telling you what register this situation actually lives in. Swords are the suit of air, of the mind, of language, of the story a person tells about what happened. Cups are the suit of feeling, and when a spread on a subject like this comes up entirely in swords, it is saying, quite plainly, that what is unresolved here is not primarily a matter of the heart. It is a matter of the account, of what happened and what it meant, and who is carrying which version of it. Hold that, because it is the seed of what I am saving for the end. The card I pulled for what actually ended is the Ten of Swords, a figure lying face down on the ground, with 10 swords in their back, beneath a black sky. It is the most final card in the deck, and I want you to notice why that is a relief, rather than a horror. There is no ambiguity in that image. Nobody looks at it and wonders whether the situation might still be viable. 10 is the number of completion, and the card is deliberately excessive, because the excess is the point. It could not be added to. And along the bottom of the image, in every traditional deck, the sky is gold. The horizon is lit. It is dawn, or very close to it, and the figure cannot see it because of the position they are in. My darling, that card is saying that the ending was real. It happened, it was complete, and it does not require your continued verification. A considerable number of Leos in this situation have spent years unconsciously keeping the question open, and this card is closing it, not cruelly, but so that everything else can be assessed from solid ground. The card I pulled for what you carried afterward is the Nine of Swords, a figure sitting upright in bed in the dark, face in their hands, with 9 swords mounted on the wall behind them. Look at where the swords are, on the wall, not in the figure. Nothing in that image is currently doing any damage to anybody. This is the card of the 3 in the morning, my darling, and it is the most accurate card in the deck for what your sign has actually been living with. Not the event, the rehearsal of the event. The version at night that is worse than the version in daylight, the conversation conducted with somebody who is not present, the argument won repeatedly against a person who has never once heard it. And the reason it appeared tonight is specific. A great deal of what you have been carrying is not the injury. It is the account of the injury, revised and sharpened over years by an extremely capable mind, with nothing else to do at 2 in the morning. And the third card, for what they have been living with, is the 5 of Swords. A figure in the foreground holding 3 swords, with 2 more on the ground, smirking, while 2 other figures walk away toward a rough sea with their heads down. It is the card of the victory that cost more than it was worth. And here is the specific reason it appeared, and it is the closest thing to an answer this spread contains. The figure in the foreground won. That is not in question. He is holding the swords and the others are leaving. And the expression on his face, which most readers describe as smug, is in most decks something closer to hollow, and the sky behind him is turbulent. My darling, that is a person who got what they wanted at the time, and has been living with the exchange rate ever since. Not being punished, simply holding the thing they took, and finding that it is not worth what it cost. That is regret, in its actual form, not tears, arithmetic that has finally been done. Now, before I take you further, let me pause. If what I have said so far has landed, if one of the 5 kinds produced a small drop, if the 9 of Swords and those swords on the wall described your last several years more accurately than you would like, tap that little like button below this video. It is a small gesture and it does something quite real. It tells YouTube that this matters to actual people, and it carries it to another Leo who is at this moment conducting an argument in her head against somebody who is not in the room. Your like is how she finds it. And if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment. Subscribe and turn on the bell. I make these readings for every sign, and I make them so they can be found whenever somebody needs them, rather than only during a particular week. Now let me tell you about Vivian. Vivian was a Leo client of mine, born at the very end of July, who came to me in her 50s, about a letter. 11 years earlier, a business partnership had ended, and it had ended in a way that was not simply commercial. She and the other person had built something together over 9 years, and they had been close in the way people are close when they have built something, and at the end, he had done something that she described to me, in the first 10 minutes, with a precision that told me she had described it to herself several thousand times. He had let her take responsibility for a decision that had been his. Not dramatically, not in court, in a room, in front of 4 other people, by saying nothing at the moment when saying something, would have cost him a great deal, and would have cost her nothing. She left the partnership within the year. She rebuilt. By the time she came to me, she was, by any external measure, considerably more successful than she had been. And then he wrote to her. She brought me the letter, and I want to tell you what was in it, because it is unusual. He named the room. He named the decision. He named the 4 people who had been present. He said that he had known at the time what he was doing, and had told himself a story about it for about 2 years, and had stopped being able to tell himself that story, somewhere in the 3rd year. He did not ask for anything. He did not propose meeting. The final line was that he had been unsure for a long time whether writing would be a kindness or another thing done for his own benefit, and that he had concluded he could not tell, and had written anyway. My darling Leos, that is the second kind. Regret for the conduct, in its complete form. And I have read a great many letters in 35 years, and I have seen perhaps 6 of that quality. She asked me what to do. I told her to do nothing for a fortnight, which she found intolerable and did anyway. And when we spoke again, she said something I have quoted ever since. She said, I have spent 11 years wanting exactly this, and I got exactly this, and I feel almost nothing. What is wrong with me? Nothing was wrong with her, and I am going to explain precisely why at the end of this reading. She answered him, eventually, 6 weeks later, with about 4 lines. They are not friends. They exchange a message perhaps twice a year. She told me a long time afterward that the letter had not healed anything, because there had been less left to heal than she had believed, and that what it had actually done was end an argument she had been having in her own head since the room. The 9 of Swords, my darling. It took the swords off the wall. Wait, before I go on, I need to interrupt myself, because I know precisely what a portion of you is thinking, and I would rather deal with it directly than let it run underneath everything else. You are thinking, Aurora, this is all very well, but they are not going to come back at all. Let me answer that honestly rather than comfortingly, because your sign will detect reassurance instantly and trust me less for it. Some of them do not. That is true, and I will not pretend otherwise. Some people carry regret for the whole of their lives and never say a word about it, and there are considerably more of those than there are of the ones who write. And I want to tell you the most common reason. Because in the absence of an explanation, your mind has supplied one, and it will not have been kind to you. The most common reason a person with genuine regret does not make contact is that they do not believe they have the right to. They have concluded, often correctly, that reaching out would be an act performed for their own relief and imposed on you. And a person who has developed enough conscience to feel real regret has usually also developed enough to see that. So they hold it, silently, sometimes for decades, and the silence is not indifference. It is the same conscience that produced the regret, operating one step further along. That is not a consolation, and I am not offering it as one. It is simply more likely to be the truth than the version your sign has been running, which is that they did not care enough. There are 3 other reasons, and I will give them briefly, because in the absence of information, your mind will keep manufacturing the cruelest available explanation, and I would rather crowd it out with accurate ones. They may not know that you know. A considerable number of people who behaved badly are unaware that the other person ever fully registered it, and they are living with a private shame about something they believe went unnoticed. Reaching out would mean disclosing it, and disclosure feels to them like making it worse. They may have decided that your life has closed around their absence and that an intrusion would be selfish. This is nearly always inaccurate, and it is nearly always sincere, and some of them are waiting for an occasion, a legitimate reason, something that would make contact explicable, and no occasion arises, because occasions do not arise between people who have not spoken in 6 years, and so it extends indefinitely, on entirely procedural grounds. Notice that all 4 of those are compatible with real regret. Notice also that none of them can be determined from the outside, because a silence produced by shame and a silence produced by indifference are identical from where you are standing, which is exactly why interpreting silence is such an unrewarding occupation. And here is what I would ask of you, and it is the only thing I am going to ask on this particular point. Do not organize your life around the arrival. There is a specific and very expensive posture available to your sign, which is not waiting exactly, but a kind of maintained readiness. A small amount of availability held in reserve. A door left slightly ajar in a way you would not describe as waiting if anybody asked. My darling, that posture costs something every single day, and it has no effect whatsoever on whether they write. None. It has an effect only on you. Now let me tell you the other kind of story, because I have told you the one that resolved. Harriet was a Leo client of mine who came to me in her 40s, some years after a marriage had ended. It had ended badly, in the ordinary way that things end badly, over about 3 years, with a long period in which she had been told, in various forms, that her reactions were excessive, and her memory of events unreliable, and her sense that something was wrong, an invention of her own temperament. She left, and she spent the following 4 years in a very particular condition which I want to describe carefully, because it is not the same as missing somebody. She was waiting to be believed, not to be loved and not to be taken back. Believed. She wanted him to say, out loud, that the things she had described accurately had in fact happened, because for 3 years she had been told they had not, and the doubt had got inside and had not come out. And she said to me, quite early on, the sentence that told me everything about the shape of it. She said, "I know what happened. I just cannot seem to know it on my own." He did apologize. 4 years in, through a mutual acquaintance at first and then directly, and it was not a vague apology either. He named several things. He used the word sorry more than once. By the standard of apologies, it was somewhere above average. And it did not work. That is the part I want you to have. She read it, and she read it again, and she waited to feel the release she had been waiting 4 years for, and it did not arrive. And then, because your sign is what it is, she concluded that the apology had not been good enough, and she began, in the following months, to want a better one. More specific, more complete, one that named the thing he had still not named. She was, I want to be clear, entirely justified in her account of what had happened. That was never in question. What had happened to her was real, and his version had been false. But she had assigned the job of settling it to the one person who had already demonstrated, over 3 years, that he was not capable of doing that job, and no version of an apology from him was ever going to be sufficient, because the deficiency was not in the apology. We worked on it for some time. What eventually shifted it was not another message from him, and it was not forgiveness, which she found she could not manufacture on demand, and which I did not ask her for. What shifted it was the day she wrote down her own account of the 3 years, in full, in order, and read it back, and did not need anybody to countersign it. She said to me afterward, and this is the sentence I most want to give you tonight. I was waiting for him to sign a document I had already written. My darling Leos, hold on to that, because it is where I am going. Pause with me for a moment. I know this has been a great deal. I want to tell you why I made this reading, and why I made it evergreen, rather than tied to a passing alignment. Leos write to me about this more than about almost anything else, and the letters arrive at strange hours, and there is nearly always an apology at the top for bothering me with something so old. There is nothing old about it. A thing that is still running is not old, whatever its start date. If this is bringing you something tonight, would you do me 3 small things? Like this video. It tells YouTube that this matters to real people, and it carries it to another Leo who has been waiting years for somebody to countersign a document she wrote herself. Subscribe and turn on the bell if you have not, because I make these readings for every sign, and I intend to keep making them. And write to me in the comments, and I want the specific thing, rather than the general thing. Not their name. I know that is what is usually asked for in a reading like this, and I am deliberately asking for something else. Give me your number. Which of the 5 kinds you believe it is? Loss, conduct, timing, the person they were, or symptom. 1 word is enough. And if you have been here a while, membership on this channel means readings reach you before they are published, and it means you and I actually speak in the comments, because I read member comments first, and I answer there more often and more personally than I am able to anywhere else. Now let me give you the practical part, because an apology is a difficult object to receive well, and your sign in particular has predictable failure modes with it. The first thing is do not answer on the day. Whatever arrives, whatever form it takes, do not respond within the first 24 hours. I would prefer 3 days. Your sign burns longer than most, and the reaction you generate in the first hours after a long-awaited contact is not your position, it is your relief. And relief is an extremely poor negotiator. It will agree to almost anything. The second thing is to identify which of the 5 you have received before you decide anything at all. Read it twice. Once for how it feels, which you cannot prevent, and then again the following day for what it actually says. Notice the grammar. Notice whether the subject of most sentences is them or you. Notice whether anything specific is named or whether the entire thing operates at the level of general sorrow. Notice whether there is a request in it, and if so, what is actually being requested. The third thing is to decide what you want the exchange to produce before you continue it. Not what you want from them, what you want to exist at the end. Your sign will skip this step, and it is the one that determines everything. There are only 3 possible outcomes of a returning apology. It becomes a resumption, it becomes a completion, or it becomes an ongoing low-level correspondence that resolves nothing and continues for years. That third one is the most common, and it is the worst of the 3, and it happens by default, to people who never decided. It is the shape a returning contact takes when neither party chooses, and I have watched it run for a decade. And the fourth thing is to answer briefly. Whatever you send a third of what you want to send. Not to be withholding. Because your sign, in the presence of a long-awaited apology, will produce something enormous, and an enormous reply raises the bar for what the next message has to be, and a bar raised high enough produces silence from people who were entirely willing to speak at a lower one. Vivian answered 11 years of it in 4 lines. Let me speak now to a few specific situations, because a returning apology sits very differently depending on where it comes from. If it is romantic, this is the one everybody assumes, and it is the one where the distinction I opened with matters most. Regret and desire are separate systems, my darling, and a romantic apology very frequently contains only the first. Watch for whether anything is being proposed. Not hinted at, proposed. A person who wants to resume something says so, eventually, and usually badly, and a person who does not will keep the entire exchange in the past tense indefinitely, warmly, without ever using a future verb. If it is family, this is the heaviest and the most common in the letters I receive, and it is the one where the second kind, regret for conduct, is rarest, because families have the longest and most heavily defended accounts of themselves. If a parent or a sibling returns with something approaching an acknowledgement, my darling, I would ask you to notice how much smaller it is than what you needed, and to consider, separately, whether it is nevertheless more than they have ever managed. Both assessments are legitimate, and they produce different decisions. If it is a friendship, friendships end without ceremony more than any other relationship and produce a specific and underrated grief, because there is no recognized language for it, and nobody treats it as a loss. If a friend returns with regret, that is one of the more genuinely repairable situations available, because friendships carry less machinery than romances, and can often be resumed at a lower intensity without either party having to resolve the whole history. And if it is professional, as it was for Vivian, here the injury is nearly always about being unsupported in a room, and the apology, when it comes, is nearly always private, and the asymmetry between a public injury and a private acknowledgement is itself part of what has to be worked through. You are permitted to notice that, and you are permitted to say so. Now I want to name something difficult, my darling, because I have never given your sign comfort without honesty, and I am not going to begin tonight. There is a specific thing your sign does while waiting for an apology, and almost nobody names it because it does not look like anything. You have been rehearsing your response. Not the reconciliation, the response. The composed, dignified, devastatingly restrained thing you will say when it finally arrives. Some of you have several versions. The gracious one, the cool one, the one that is entirely kind and leaves them with nothing to hold on to, which is your sign's speciality, and which you have refined considerably over the years. And I want to tell you what that costs, because it costs 2 things. The first is that it keeps the situation warm. A rehearsal requires the other person to be present in your mind as an audience. And a person you rehearse for is a person you are still performing to, and there is no version of moving on that includes a nightly performance. The second cost is subtler, and it damages the actual moment when it arrives. Having said your piece brilliantly in your head 400 times, You will find the real occasion strangely flat. You will say a fraction of what you meant to, because the material feels used, and the other person, who is having this exchange for the first time, will register you as indifferent. My darling, I have watched genuine reconciliations die in the first 10 minutes, for exactly that reason, and neither party ever understood what happened. So if you take one small practical thing from tonight, take this. Stop rehearsing, not because you should be spontaneous, which is not your sign's nature, and I would not ask it of you, because the rehearsal is a performance for somebody who is not in the room, and your sign should not be performing for an empty chair. Now let me speak about the apology you have already written, because almost every one of you has one, and almost none of you has ever admitted it. Somewhere in you there is a draft. You know what they would have to say. You know which incident would have to be named, in what order, with what acknowledgement of what it cost you. You have refined it over years, and it has become extremely good, and it is now considerably better written than anything an actual human being, under emotional pressure, could produce. And here is what will happen, my darling, and I want you to be prepared rather than ambushed. What arrives will not match it. It will be vaguer. It will miss the exact thing, or it will name a different thing that you had considered secondary. It will spend more words on their own state than on yours, because people writing apologies are frightened, and frightened people talk about themselves. It may contain one sentence that undoes some of the good of the rest. And your sign will read the gap between the draft and the delivery as evidence that they still do not understand. Sometimes that is exactly what it is. I am not going to tell you to accept an inadequate apology, and I have no patience for advice that instructs people to be gracious about things that were not adequate. But I want you to hold one alternative reading alongside it, and only one. It is possible for a person to understand completely and to be unable to say it well. Articulacy and comprehension are separate faculties, and they are not distributed together. Some of the most genuine regret I have encountered in 35 years arrived in the most poorly constructed sentences I have ever read, and some of the most elegant apologies I have seen were produced by people who had understood nothing and were managing an outcome. So do not grade it on the prose, my darling. Grade it on the specificity. A person who has genuinely arrived at something can name the particular occasion. That is the only reliable marker, and it is worth more than every adjective in the letter. Now let me give you the ritual, and I want to warn you that it is not the one you are expecting, and that it involves no candles at all. You are going to write your own version. Find a space where you will not be interrupted for perhaps 40 minutes. Make it comfortable rather than ceremonial, because this one is work rather than theater, and dressing it up will get in the way. Take paper. Write, at the top, the plain heading, "What happened?" and then write your account. In order, from the beginning of the difficulty to the end of it. Not the argument, not the case for the prosecution, which your sign can produce in about 4 minutes and which is a different document. The account. What occurred, in what sequence, and what you did in response, including the parts that do not flatter you, because a record that has been curated is not a record and you will not fully believe it afterward. Write until it is finished. It will take longer than you expect, and it will be uncomfortable in a specific way around the middle, which is normal, and which is the point at which most people stop. Do not stop there. The discomfort in the middle is the place where the version you have been carrying and the version that actually happened diverge slightly, and reconciling those two is most of the value of this exercise. When you have finished, read it back once, out loud if you can manage it, because your sign is ruled by the sun, and the sun does not do anything privately, and a thing said aloud in a room occupies a different position in the mind than a thing read silently. And then, at the bottom, write one line and one line only. This is what happened, and I do not require anybody else to agree. Then put it away somewhere private. Not destroyed, kept. And I want to say one thing about why it is kept rather than burned, because a great many rituals end in destruction, and this one deliberately does not. You are not releasing this, my darling, you are establishing it. A burned document is a gesture of letting go, which is appropriate for things you are finished with. This is a record, and the entire purpose of it is that it exists, in your own handwriting, dated, in a form that can be returned to. Because the thing your sign has been suffering is not that the memory hurts. It is that the memory has felt provisional, unratified, held against a version of events that somebody else maintained, with nothing on your side but recollection, and recollection under sustained pressure begins to feel like opinion. A written account is not opinion, it is a document, and it will still be there in 3 years when the argument starts up again at 2 in the morning, which it will, and you will be able to go and read it rather than reconstruct it, and the difference between those two things is considerable. That is the ritual, my darling, and it is what Harriet did, 4 years too late, and it did in one evening what she had spent 4 years waiting for a man to do. And now, my darling Leo, I want to give you the thing I told you at the beginning that I was saving. I warned you it would sound cynical for about 30 seconds. Give me the full minute. Here it is. The apology is not for you. When somebody returns after years and says they are sorry, the act of saying it is something they need to perform for their own sake. It closes a loop in their own moral accounting. It allows them to stop being, in their own private ledger, a person who did that thing and never addressed it. That is what an apology does, structurally, for the person giving it, and it is why so many of them arrive with that faint quality of having been composed for a while, and why the sender so often goes quiet afterward with a kind of visible relief. Now stay with me, because here is where it stops being cynical. It does not mean it is insincere. Both things are entirely true at once, and this is the part almost nobody holds. The regret is real, the remorse is real, and the act of expressing it is something they required for themselves, and those facts do not cancel each other out any more than a gift chosen partly for the pleasure of giving, it stops being a gift. But here is what it means for you, and this is the freedom I promised. You are not the custodian of their peace. You do not have to grade it. You do not have to decide whether it was sufficient. You do not have to determine whether they have suffered enough, or understood enough, or said the right thing in the right order. You do not have to forgive them on any particular schedule, and you certainly do not have to feel better because a document arrived. All of that is a job you have been holding, my darling, and it was never yours. It has been assigned to you by a piece of common wisdom that says an apology creates an obligation in the person receiving it, and I do not believe it does. And now let me tell you why Vivian felt almost nothing, because I promised I would. She had assumed the letter would release her. It did not, because it could not, because the thing holding her was never in his possession. Do you remember what the cards said? All 3 in swords. Not a single cup. The suit of the mind, of language, of the account. What she had been carrying for 11 years was not a wound. It was an argument, a version of events that she had been forced to hold alone, against a room of 4 people who had watched and said nothing, and every one of those 11 years had been spent proving it to a jury that was not in session. And his letter did not heal a feeling. It ended a dispute. That is why it produced almost nothing dramatic and why she described it afterward as taking the swords off the wall. My darling Leo, if you are waiting for an apology, I would like you to check what you are actually waiting for. Because in my experience, it is very rarely the feeling. It is nearly always the record. You want it established that the thing happened as you remember it, and you have been waiting for the only other witness to sign. And you do not need them to sign, which is the whole of what I have to give you tonight. And it is what Harriet found in one evening with a piece of paper. And I want to add one thing, because I can hear the objection forming, and it is a fair one. Your sign will say, but it is not the same. A thing I write myself is not evidence. Evidence requires another party. My darling, that is precisely the belief that has cost you the years, and I want to take it apart carefully rather than simply contradicting it. You were there. For the whole of it, from the first moment to the last, at every occasion, with full access to your own internal state and to theirs as far as anybody has access to another person's. There is no witness in the world better placed. The reason you do not credit your own account is not that it is unreliable. It is that during the period in question somebody told you it was, repeatedly, and a person told that often enough begins to outsource verification as a matter of habit. That habit is the injury, my darling. It is not a reasonable epistemic position that you arrived at independently. It was installed. And the peculiar consequence of it is that you have been requiring a signature from the one person in the world with the strongest possible interest in the document saying something else. If it comes, my darling, receive it. Take 3 days. Work out which of the 5 it is. Answer briefly, or do not answer. But do not wait for it in order to begin. The document is already written. It has been written for years, extremely carefully, by the only person who was actually there for the whole of it. You are permitted to countersign it yourself. My dear Leo, before I let you go, 3 small things. 1. If any part of this reading found you tonight, if you picked one of the 5, if the 9 of Swords or Harriet's sentence about the document landed somewhere real, tap that like button. It is the simplest way to tell YouTube to carry this to another Leo who is at this moment refining an apology that somebody else is supposed to deliver. 2. Subscribe and turn on the bell. I make these readings for every sign, and I make them so they can be found whenever somebody needs them, rather than only during a particular week. If you become a member, readings reach you before they are published, and you and I actually speak in the comments, because I read member comments first. 3. And this is the one I care about most. Give me the number. Which of the 5 kinds? And if you are willing, 1 line from your own account, in your own words, about what actually happened. Not the whole thing, 1 line. I read every single comment, truly, and I want to tell you why I am asking for that particular thing rather than a name. Because a comment section full of names tells nobody anything. A comment section in which 20 women have each written 1 plain line about something that happened to them without asking anybody to verify it is the entire lesson of this video enacted in public, and the Leo who scrolls it at 2 in the morning will understand it considerably faster than I could explain it in an hour. And if this reading gave you something, and you ever want to say thank you more directly, a super thanks is never expected and always felt, and it is a genuine part of how I keep making these readings as carefully as I make them. If you know another Leo who has been waiting a long time for somebody to say it, send this to her tonight. You may not realize how much a single share matters. It is how this work finds the person who needs it. Thank you, my darling. This community has become something I genuinely did not expect when I began. Somebody from your past is going to return with regret. I believe that, and I have told you why it happens to your sign, and I have given you the 5 forms it takes. But the regret was never the thing, my darling. And the apology, when and if it comes, will be a document that somebody else needed to write. Yours has been finished for years. Sign it. I am Madame Aurora from Manhattan, and I love you, my dear Leo. I will see you in the next reading.